The gala glittered with silk gowns and chandeliers, but no one expected the night's most unforgettable moment to come from a waitress. When Naomi crossed the dance floor and asked the scarred son of a billionaire to dance, gasps rippled across the room. One song later, every guest was silent. The young man was transformed, and the powerful CEO stood in tears. This wasn't just a dance, it was a lesson, a reversal, a story that would go viral across America. And it all began with one daring question: would you like to dance? The ballroom smelled of roses and expensive cologne, the chandeliers dripping golden light from 50 feet above. Waiters in pressed uniforms hurried between glittering tables, their trays silver and heavy with champagne flutes. A live band thrummed softly in the corner, strings and piano weaving a gentle backdrop for one of the city's richest men to flaunt his wealth. Charles Whitmore, billionaire CEO of Whitmore Global, commanded the center of the room like a general in a kingdom of velvet and glass. His fortune built the skyscrapers that framed the city skyline. His name carried weight like thunder. Tonight's gala, branded a charity benefit, felt more like a coronation. No one came to question him. They came to be seen, to flatter, to orbit his gravity. At the edge of the marble floor near the catering stations, Naomi Brooks adjusted a tray of water glasses. She was young, slender, wearing the crisp black and white of the serving staff. She had been working the gala floor for hours, weaving through satin gowns and tailored tuxedos, eyes trained low, body precise, never stepping out of line. Invisible. That was the art she had mastered. People of her position were meant to fade into the backdrop of luxury, like shadows no one acknowledged. But Naomi wasn't blind. She saw the way Charles basked in admiration, the way his guests fawned, and, most of all, the way his eyes avoided a figure near the back of the ballroom. It was his son, Andrew. Andrew was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a suit crisp enough to rival his father's. Yet he remained apart, alone beside a table draped in cream silk. His left cheek and much of his jaw carried scars from the fire a year earlier that had nearly claimed his life. The burns etched across his skin told a story people didn't want to see. Guests gave him polite nods, then turned quickly away, too uncomfortable to stare but too uneasy to linger. His father spoke of legacy and family pride, yet his son stood isolated, drinking ginger ale instead of champagne. Naomi noticed the way he shifted his weight, uncomfortable not from pain but from the silence carved around him. A hush fell as Charles tapped his champagne glass. He raised it high, smiling with brilliant teeth. "Tonight we toast to progress, to the empire we continue to build, to the generosity of those in this room, and to the future brightened by each of your contributions." Applause rippled like a rehearsed wave. The band picked up into a brighter swing as couples swept onto the dance floor, gowns shimmering, heels gliding across marble. Andrew remained still. His hand adjusted his cuff, his eyes flicking once toward the crowd, then steadying on the floor as though gravity itself kept him anchored. Naomi felt something stir, an unreasonable impulse that defied the discipline of her job. She wasn't supposed to notice him. She wasn't supposed to care that the billionaire's son stood alone, scarred, invisible in a room where everyone pretended every word and shimmer mattered. But she cared anyway. During a lull, she set her tray down with the others, adjusted her stiff apron and stepped quietly toward the edge of the dance floor. The music swelled again. Guests twirled like flickers of silk and shadow. Naomi walked deliberately until she stood across from Andrew. He looked up, startled, his pale green eyes sharpened in surprise, then immediately softened at the absence of pity in hers. She didn't flinch. She didn't dart her gaze away from his scars. She just looked. "Would you like to dance?" Naomi asked softly. The words struck like glass dropped onto marble. He blinked, his mouth parting. Excuse me?" She smiled faintly. "Dance. Just one song." For the briefest second, the scarred lines on his face seemed to stiffen, bracing for the mockery he'd grown used to. But Naomi's eyes carried no cruelty, no curiosity, only invitation. Against his instinct to refuse, he found himself nodding. Something like disbelief flickered through him as she extended her hand. Slowly, cautiously, he set his palm in hers. Every head didn't notice instantly, not at first. But when Andrew stepped onto the dance floor, led by a waitress in plain black uniform, ripples fractured the ballroom's choreography. Couples slowed, whispers traced edges of silk gowns. "Isn't that Why is she? Confusion swept like wind through tall grass. Naomi didn't look at them. She placed her other hand gently against Andrew's shoulder, guiding him into rhythm with the swell of violins. He held tense at first, the room clawing against his every instinct to hide, to pull back, to retreat into solitude. But then Naomi whispered, "Ignore them. Just the music. Just this." He exhaled shakily, and together they began to move. The band's tempo lifted into a playful rhythm. Naomi's shoes brushed marble with easy grace. Andrew, hesitant at first, began to follow her lead. His scarred cheek caught light, and instead of hiding, Naomi locked her eyes to his, anchoring him. For the first time in a year, dancing didn't feel impossible. It felt as though he was more than his scars, as if he was just a man moving to music with a woman who saw him. Then whispers turned into silence. The laughter faded. Slowly, the entire gala seemed to stop its chattering orbit. Naomi twirled, the hem of her skirt catching motion, and when she returned to Andrew's steady hand, the weight of 100 eyes bore down. But in her expression he found no shame, only encouragement to keep moving. At the edge of the floor, Charles Whitmore's champagne glass stopped midway to his lips. For the first time that night, the titan of industry, who had faced takeovers, hostile boards, adversarial press, stood utterly stripped of words. His son, scarred and alone for too long, was not just seen, he was celebrated. And Charles, the man who had tried to bury his own discomfort by burying Andrew in shadows, felt something crack behind his ribs. A tear welled uninvited, and slid from the corner of his sharp eye. The violin swelled, a long pull of bows that reverberated in the marble, and Naomi twirled back into Andrew's hold, as if she had been dancing with him her whole life. His scars glistened under chandelier light, but for once no one flinched. They saw something else instead. Movement, rhythm, connection where only silence had lived before. At first the whispering persisted. Wealthy heads leaned in, faces tight with judgment, wrapped in astonishment. "Why her?" one woman muttered, her diamond necklace trembling against her collarbone. "A waitress," another hissed. "And him? Out there for everyone to look at." But the whispers began to falter as eyes recorded something undeniable, joy carving its way through scar tissue. Andrew's lips even inched into the faintest smile, tentative, unsteady, but real. He hadn't smiled in a room full of strangers since the fire. Naomi tilted her head, her own voice a low, coaxing hum over the music. "See, they can't take this from you." Not tonight. For once, Andrew didn't argue with himself. He stepped again, then again, until the rhythm absorbed his doubt and replaced it with momentum. His hand pressed with quiet strength against Naomi's hip, his other cradling hers without trembling now. And then it happened. Someone at the edge of the floor, a graying gentleman in a three-piece suit, began to clap softly. At first it was awkward, half mockery, but then a second and a third voice joined until the applause thickened. Suddenly those diamond-draped critics turned their own shame into smiles and began patting hands together. Applause washed the air. Her steps guided, his shoulders straightened. Together they wove through a tide of disbelief, turning reluctantly into admiration. Near the center of the hall, Charles exhaled heavily, trying and failing to mask it with his hand, polishing at his glass. He had canned speeches scripted to inspire stockholders, but no script prepared him to watch dignity, carried not by him but by the son he had quietly kept in shadows. His chest tightened, not in embarrassment but in something sharper, regret. Naomi glanced past Andrew's shoulder and caught Charles's eyes. For the briefest second her gaze locked to his. There was no defiance there, no plea, only a reminder. "You've hidden what should have been celebrated all along." Charles blinked, jaw locked. For a man who controlled acquisitions with signatures, there were suddenly no documents strong enough to sign away what Naomi had just done with a dance. When the music slowed at last, Naomi turned one final time, her skirt catching light, and came to rest in Andrew's hand. The band fell into silence, and so did the audience. Then, as if releasing something they'd held too long, the room thundered with applause. Andrew, startled, looked out into the clapping silhouettes. His throat worked, his eyes widened slightly, and all he could whisper was, "They're looking at me." Naomi smiled. "Yes, and not for the scars." He nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth curling, disbelief melting into something fainter but deeper. Gratitude. At the edge, the bandleader lifted his bow, nodded toward the pair, and shifted into a softer reprise, strings layering like a soundtrack written for this exact moment. Naomi curtsied gently, stepping back with dignity, never making it about herself. Andrew remained planted in the center, no longer hidden, framed in applause, his scarred face lifted into light. Charles took an unsteady step forward. No business associates flanked him now, no glass of champagne shielded his hand. He walked until he stood close enough for his voice to travel only to his son and the young waitress who had dared. He cleared his throat, his voice failing him at first. "Andrew," he whispered, low and uneven. The applause dimmed as those closest strained ears for words, denied to them all evening. Andrew turned slowly, meeting his father's trembling eyes. Silence crawled back across the room, thick with anticipation. Naomi gently rested her palm on Andrew's shoulder, grounding him. "You don't have to speak for him," she murmured, but Andrew did. "What is it, Dad?" Charles's gaze fell hard to the floor, then rose, catching his son's scars straight on. Not the face he had once lost in the fire, but the one he had denied since then. His throat strained as one tear escaped unbidden. He swallowed hard. "You've never looked more powerful in your life," he said. The words landed heavy, honest, cracking open years of unspoken distance. Around them, the clapping softened into something entirely different. Reverence. Andrew blinked at his father, speechless, and for the first time in a long time didn't avert his eyes. The song ended. Naomi bowed herself away, slipping effortlessly back toward her station. But as she moved through the crowd, every guest parted like water around her. The whispers now weren't about a waitress stepping out of line, but about the courage it had taken to rewrite the script of an evening in just 3 minutes of melody. Charles extended his hand to his son, awkward like a man untrained in gestures of openness. Andrew hesitated, then slowly placed his scarred hand into his father's waiting palm. Applause swelled anew at the sight, sealing the moment in memory. At the far edge, Naomi retrieved her tray wordlessly, her heart racing. She didn't crave the spotlight she'd borrowed. She had only wanted Andrew to remember himself again. And quietly, she had wanted his father to remember him too. Charles lifted his hand once more, this time not to toast the crowd, but to clear his throat into a voice that quivered. "Tonight we witnessed more than charity," he said unevenly. "We witnessed courage." Gasps punctuated his trembling honesty. For a man whose empire was built on steel and pride, vulnerability was the one currency he had always hoarded. And Naomi had forced him to spend some. Many would remember this as the night a waitress chose to dance with a scarred son. But Charles knew as the applause roared again, that for him, it was the night a father rediscovered both shame and pride in one stroke. The applause still echoed as people returned to their tables, but the undercurrent was electric, half admiration, half discomfort. A billionaire's son dancing with a waitress had shifted the atmosphere in a way money couldn't control. People adjusted their ties, sipped cocktails more quickly, and spoke to each other in hushed fragments. Naomi slipped back into the shadows by the service station, her posture calm, though her pulse still drummed in her chest. The dance had lasted all of 3 minutes, but it felt like an entire life folded into one moment. She set her tray down, catching her breath quietly. "You shouldn't have done that." The voice cut sharp to her left. It was Marie Kensington, one of the gala's patrons, swathed in emerald silk with diamonds dripping from her ears. She glared at Naomi as if her very existence had offended gravity itself. Naomi lifted her chin. "Done what?" "Embarrassed him." "Embarrassed us," Marie's lip curled. "There are boundaries. Service staff serve. They don't insert themselves into moments reserved for the elite. Do you realize how out of place that looked?" Naomi's fingers grazed the edge of the tray gently, but did not flinch. "You mean showing kindness? Showing him someone saw him? Yes, I realize it looked very different." That was the point. Gasps fluttered among Marie's circle of friends behind her. A billionaire's wife wasn't used to hearing defiance from a woman whose paycheck depended on invisibility. Marie's face reddened. "You're replaceable," she hissed. "Whatever sympathy you thought you earned will fade the moment this crowd leaves. You'll be sweeping floors again by tomorrow morning." Naomi inhaled, resisting the rising well of fire in her chest. "Maybe. But he'll remember this dance when he looks in the mirror, and maybe his father will too. That's worth more than tomorrow's shift." At that moment, a man in a grey tuxedo stepped closer, drawn by the rising tension. He was Senator Everett, one of Charles Whitmore's political allies. His lined face remained neutral, but his eyes studied Naomi carefully. "She's right," he said finally, surprising everyone, including Naomi. "I've attended a dozen of these galas. I don't recall one single speech, one single donor brag, not even one of Charles's toasts. But that dance," he gestured toward the still-glowing ballroom floor. "I'll remember it as long as I live, and so will everyone else here." Marie scoffed and stepped back indignantly, muttering about standards as she stormed toward the bar. Naomi blinked at the senator. "Why would you defend me?" Everett's mouth curved faintly. "Because change rarely comes from wealth. It comes when someone nobody expects does something everybody remembers." He lowered his voice. "You've embarrassed the right people tonight. That takes courage." Before Naomi could respond, the dinner bell chimed and Charles returned to the microphone at the head of the room. His face was stiff, but his eyes wet, betraying cracks in his armor. Beside him stood Andrew, still looking dazed from the dance. A palm pressed nervously at his jacket, as if ensuring himself it hadn't all been an illusion. "I realized tonight wasn't what you expected," Charles began. His voice wobbled, and several guests locked in, sensing rawness where polish usually dominated. "You expected wealth displays, toasts to success. But what I didn't expect was to be reminded of something I've lost sight of. Humility." Murmurs swept. Charles paused, head lowered. "My son is the true center of this evening. Scarred but strong. He danced tonight not because I encouraged him, but because someone outside this circle of power showed him he was worthy of being seen. For that I am grateful beyond words." Naomi froze at her post, listening. His gaze found hers across the hall, pinning her despite the swarm of wealth between them. "And to Miss Naomi Brooks," he added, "who showed us courage under chandeliers brighter than most truths, I say thank you. You gave my son back his reflection tonight." Gasps erupted. Some roared applause, others clapped politely. But for Naomi it was like the world had tilted. Never in her wildest thoughts would she imagine the CEO pulling her name into his speech, acknowledging a waitress before a room full of donors. Yet the shock wasn't all admiration. In one corner, critics whispered, "He's lost control." Another muttered, "A CEO begging thanks from staff. Weakness, it'll rattle the market." But still the applause rang longer than the sneers. Andrew, cheeks flushing, bent toward the microphone and cleared his throat. "I just want to say, sometimes it only takes one moment of bravery from one person to change how you see yourself. Tonight that person was Naomi. Thank you." His voice cracked, but the room wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening. Naomi felt her throat tighten, her tray trembling slightly in her hand. This was no longer about her. It was about what she had carried into the room. Dignity. Humanity. That money couldn't buy or bury. As the applause swelled again, Marie Kensington muttered bitterly, "Charity galas are not for uplifting the help. They'll turn this into scandal by morning." But even her venom couldn't drown out the roar of claps. Naomi turned back toward the kitchen, her duty calling, but her heart steady now. She didn't need their approval. She had restored something larger to Andrew and crackled something raw in Charles. That was enough. Back near the podium, Charles raised his champagne high, his voice firmer now. "Tonight let this be remembered not merely as an evening of charity, but as an evening of confrontation, with wealth, with pride, with blindness. I once thought building towers made me strong. Tonight I saw strength in a dance." Guests rose one by one, applauding harder, some out of sincerity, others out of trained loyalty. But for once sincerity outweighed performance. Naomi glanced one last time before vanishing back to her duties. Andrew's face carried something new, hope flickering through scars. Charles's hand lifted to wipe another tear he could no longer hide. And in that contrast, the billionaires subdued, the waitress grounded, an empire shifted slightly on its axis. The gala ended in a blur of applause and murmurs, clinking glasses and hurried whispers, as donors packed their jewels into limousines and chauffeurs lined the marble steps outside. By midnight, the ballroom was empty except for tired waitstaff clearing tables and stacking chairs. Naomi moved slowly, her body aching from the night's wait, but her mind still raced through the memory of the dance. Each step she took through the ballroom floor still felt imprinted, like her shoes had left behind invisible marks no one could mop up, a trace of defiance that could not be erased. "Naomi," the banquet manager hissed, snapping her from the thought. "Mr. Whitmore wants to see you before you leave." Naomi froze, pulse kicking. expectation pressed down with dread. Was she about to be fired? Humiliated for breaking protocol? She steadied herself and followed, weaving through the staff until she reached a quieter lounge off the ballroom. Charles Whitmore stood there in shirt sleeves, tie loosened, sipping neat whiskey against the glow of a fireplace. The billionaire everyone feared looked smaller now, etched with lines of exhaustion he couldn't buy away. He gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Naomi hesitated, then obeyed. For a long moment he said nothing, just rubbing the rim of his glass as if trying to polish clarity into existence. Finally his voice came low, almost reluctant. "You made me cry tonight." Naomi blinked, unsure if speaking was safe. Charles continued, his words fragmented. "No deal, no merger, no skyscraper boardroom could do what you did. In 3 minutes of melody, you put my son back into the world. And you forced me to see him again, really see him. He stopped, swallowed hard. "I've been a coward, Naomi. A cowardly father hiding his own shame behind empire." Naomi's chest tightened. She had never imagined her small act would crack the giant this way. "Sir," she began cautiously, "all I did was dance." His eyes locked into hers sharply. "Don't cheapen it. You shattered illusions tonight, mine most of all." Naomi held his gaze. "Then don't rebuild them." The silence stilled between them. Charles exhaled, almost a laugh, rueful. "A waitress giving me ultimatums. Never thought I'd live to see it, but maybe I deserved it." He downed the rest of his glass and set it down. "You'll stay on staff if that's what worries you. In fact, should you choose, you'll move higher. My events division, double pay." Naomi stiffened. It sounded like reward, but also silencing compensation. She shook her head slightly. "I don't want reward. What I want is for Andrew to keep being seen. You don't need me for that, you need yourself." He blinked at her, the sincerity of her refusal cutting deeper than gratitude. "You remind me of my wife," he murmured finally. "She raised a son who danced before the world, before the fire stole his ease. Out tonight you gave him another chance." His voice cracked and he turned, covering the tremor with his hand. Naomi stood gently. "Then don't waste it, Mr. Whitmore. Tomorrow let him walk into your boardroom or your home with the same pride. Let him see himself through your eyes, not just mine." He looked at her, eyes glassy again, and nodded once like steel conceding to flame. By morning the newspapers had the story. Their society columnist described a shocking but unforgettable sight. The reclusive heir of Whitmore Global dancing proudly on the floor, led by none other than a member of the catering staff. Headlines mixed praise with scandal. "Waitress stuns gala. Dances with Scarred Whitmore son." Charity event's most memorable donor wasn't rich. She was brave. On social media, images had already leaked, snapped by guests too discreet to flash cameras, but quick to post under dim light. Hashtags trended. "A dance of courage, Whitmore son for Naomi." Some praised the humanity. Finally, someone saw him. This is real grace. Others criticized the breach of decorum. Unprofessional. Gratitude doesn't excuse boundaries being crossed. Naomi ignored the noise, splitting her morning between sleep and her other job at the cafe downtown. But her phone buzzed steady with calls from news outlets, influencer accounts, even talk shows booking her story. She turned them all down. She hadn't done it for headlines. She had done it for Andrew. But Andrew didn't stay invisible anymore. That afternoon, cameras caught him walking down Fifth Avenue. Scars bright under the sun, chin tilted higher than before. He even waved when reporters asked how the dance made him feel. "Seen," he said simply, "for the first time in a long time." By evening, Charles Whitmore released a public statement. For once, it wasn't a press-crafted manifesto. His voice cracked on screen as he said, "Wealth is nothing without family." Last night reminded me of humility. I have been reminded by a young woman whose name the world is now learning, Naomi Brooks, and I thank her. Shockwaves rippled, critics stunned, supporters awed. Shares of Whitmore Global ticked upward, bizarrely, stabilized by honesty rather than polish. Inside her small apartment, Naomi sat stunned as her name rolled across news tickers. Her single simple gesture magnified beyond comprehension. Her phone buzzed with texts from co-workers. "You changed everything." But what mattered most was the message that arrived near midnight. Andrew's number, short and raw. "You gave me back my reflection. How do I thank you?" Her reply was simple. "Live, fully. That's thanks enough. The Whitmore estate was quiet in the days that followed, though the world outside thundered with noise. Reporters lingered at the gates, tabloids speculated about family feuds, while social media spun the night into legend. But within the walls of the mansion, what mattered was far smaller and far deeper. Charles sat with his son in the library, a room lined with leather-bound volumes that always seemed to mock Andrew with their polished perfection. For years they had sat apart, speaking through business updates and empty pleasantries. Now silence stretched again, but it wasn't avoidance. It was fear on a father's part that his chance at forgiveness had sailed long ago. Finally, Andrew broke it. "All my life you wanted me strong, Dad. When the fire took my face, you looked away like you couldn't stand me anymore." He swallowed. "Last week, Naomi did what you couldn't. She danced with me anyway. Why did it take her to make you see me?" The billionaire, who had stared down hostile takeovers and ruthless rivals, felt his throat tighten. He leaned forward, eyes soft. "Because I was a coward, son. You're right. I hid behind Empire, because it was easier than facing how much you'd suffered. That waitress reminded me you're not broken. You're more resilient than anyone I know, and I'll never forgive myself for waiting until she showed me." Andrew studied him with cautious disbelief, but something in his father's cracked voice felt real. For the first time in years, he let the tension drop from his shoulders. "All I wanted was to be seen, not as a scar, not as pity. Just seen. You are," Charles whispered, "now and always. And if you'll allow it, I'll make sure the world sees too." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It brimmed with reconciliation taking root. Father and son sat together not as CEO and heir, not as scar and shadow, but as family nearly lost to distance. Elsewhere, Naomi rinsed dishes in her tiny kitchen, listening faintly to a radio where anchors still replayed the gala clip. She shook her head with a half-smile. For her, it wasn't a scandal or spectacle. It was 3 minutes of music and humanity that had simply felt necessary. She never asked for headlines, only hoped Andrew remembered the man he still was. And he did. Weeks later, at another benefit, Andrew attended proudly at his father's side. Cameras flashed, people braced for discomfort, yet when the music started, he stepped onto the floor himself. No prompting, no pity, just choice. He danced. Alone, confident, scar and all. And Charles Whitmore, watching from the edge, let tears come again, unashamed this time. It wasn't money, nor speeches, nor towering skyscrapers that reshaped their legacy. It was one waitress, one song, one act of unexpected compassion that forced a billionaire to weep and gave a scarred son the courage to shine again. And that night, as whispers became awe, everyone knew, some moments aren't measured in fortunes, they're measured in courage. By the end of the night, the billionaire had no speech big enough to mask what he felt. His tears told the story that money never could. Compassion is stronger than pride, and courage is stronger than scars. Naomi vanished back into the shadows of service, but her one song became legend, retold across headlines and whispered in living rooms. Sometimes history isn't written by the wealthy, it's rewritten by those the world overlooks. If that moment moved you, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because the next story of truth and power will leave you speechless.